Joining us now, David MacKinnon. He is a senior fellow at the Winnipeg-based Frontier Centre for Public Policy and has just started his own institute here in Toronto, the Ontario Institute for Public Policy, and we're glad to have you in that chair tonight.
Thank you for having me.
This is, I want to warn everybody who's watching us right now, and you too, this is one of the hardest to understand subjects that we will ever discuss about public policy on this program. So you got to really, you're going to have to baby steps us through this, right?
It's very difficult.
Equalization. It's obviously been very important to the building blocks of this country and very hard to understand. So remind us, equalization is what?
Equalization is a major federal program to redistribute funds from one region of Canada to the other, or more accurately, from one group of taxpayers to another.
So the haves help the have-not, basically.
Haves helps the have-not. About 60% of the funding for equalization comes from Ontario and Alberta taxpayers.
And that's still the case even though technically Ontario is a have-not province?
Ontario is a have-not province for equalization only. But there are four ways the federal government distributes money around the countryside. It does so through equalization. It does through discriminatory treatment of citizens in EI and other transfer payments to persons. It does by hundreds of built-in discriminatory features in regular programs, ranging from airport rental agreements to funding of marathons. And it does so by the location of federal offices as economic development tools far away from the customer base. So there's in fact four ways the federal government goes about this.
Let's focus on the first one for now. Equalization as it exists today as a program, I know there's complicated formulas and all that, we're not going to get into that. What's wrong with it today?
Well, several things. First of all, the government of Canada has undertaken in some 50 years, has never studied its impact on anybody. Now, you and I discussed this before, and you had the Minister of Finance aboard, and he referred people to the expert panel on equalization study, and that did not deal with economic impact. So in 50 years, we have had a huge program to redistribute funding, and nobody in the government of Canada has done a study on its economic impact, its impact on productivity, on consumer spending, on competitiveness, or anything else that's important in terms of economics.
Have you studied those things?
Yes, I have.
And?
I've studied them from two sides. This system is extremely damaging to Canada, and it's particularly damaging to the citizens of Ontario. Canada as a whole, what we are doing is we're redistributing $40 or $50 billion a year, something like that. No one really knows the exact total because it isn't reported. But we're distributing that amount of money to provinces with a much lower level of productivity than Ontario. For example, Prince Edward Island has about 70% of the level of productivity of this province. Quebec has about 90, and the rest are in between. That's a huge shift. By itself, it's probably enough to outweigh everything else the federal government does to improve productivity. And we've been doing it for 50 years. I would argue that the most serious consequence of this is that our national productivity performance, as comments from Bank of Canada presidents and by the former clerk of the Privy Council have all noted, our productivity performance is terrible. This is the single biggest cause of that poor performance.
Let's put up a couple of charts here that may help reflect that which you are describing for us right now. First on childcare, then on doctors. Here is the chart on how childcare, the existence of regulated spaces across the country, and as you suggested, there's Prince Edward Island, #1 in the country. And you go all the way down the list, and there's Saskatchewan at the other end, and Ontario is sort of somewhere in the middle. Let's go to doctors as well. Remember, these are services. These are government services for people. How about doctors per 100,000 people? And again, Nova Scotia, Quebec, Newfoundland, I guess not surprising, on the high end of things. And then there's Ontario closer to the bottom end of things. You look at these figures, and what jumps out at you?
What jumps out at me is that Ontario has the least, or nearly the least, accessible public services in Canada. And that is particularly serious, if I might say, for healthcare and for children. For children, there is an argument that much that is done in the first 5 years of your life influences the remaining years. And if you can have the best possible services in those first 5 years, that's a very important policy. We are behind in that. I'm on the member of the Governing Council of the College of Physicians and Surgeons.
Of Ontario.
Of Ontario. The biggest problem, there's huge stresses in the system, but the biggest problem, I would argue, is that we have fewer hospital beds, fewer physicians, fewer nurses than almost all of the other provinces that we subsidize so heavily.
So let's paint the picture here. Ontario, through its legal obligated generosity to other provinces of the country, is sending more and more money out to other places in the country, the result of which you say is that other places in the country are enjoying a level of service well beyond what the people here have.
Massively superior.
Massively
my
superior.
native province, Prince Edward Island, has 3 times the number of nursing home beds in relation to population, almost 4 times as many provincial public servants. It has 2 or 3 times as many hospital sites as Ontario has in relation to population, and so on. These are not just minor discrepancies, they are massive. And in terms of Ontario's future, I would argue that they're very troubling, and they argue that our future will be shadowed darkly indeed by these discrepancies.
I can see people in other parts of the country watching this and saying, yeah, this guy's an Ontarian. I mean, he says he's from PEI, he's an Ontarian, he's just trying to be an Ontario firster. But you have lived elsewhere in this country, right?
I have lived elsewhere, and I served as in a very senior capacity in the Nova Scotia Public Service. My wife and I moved back to Ontario 30 years ago, and this problem was evident to us then. I have been talking about it for 30 long years, hoping that this slow train wreck could be derailed.
Now, you say it's a train wreck because taken to its logical extension with no action 5-10 years down the road, what do you see?
Well, I see, first of all, Canada's productivity performance will continue to deteriorate, and it will not be able to compete effectively in the world of the 21st century. That's the most serious thing. For the province of Ontario, I see an increasingly grey and threadbare future. The provincial government can work very hard, as it does, at changing that. But asking Ontario to compete in the world of the 21st century with this program on its back is like asking a marathon runner to run with a 10-pound backpack on its back. It won't work.
I hear you, but I've had this conversation with members of Parliament many times from Ontario, who, when they say they get to Ottawa and they go there with every good intention of fighting the good fight for the province of Ontario, and then they realize Ontario is so much better off than almost all the other provinces when they get there, and they feel kind of sheepish about asking for a bigger chunk of the pie for us. Is that what you're asking for?
They've been conned. Everything that the federal government and the recipient provinces have been saying about the effects of this program is essentially not true. We are over-subsidizing. People come from Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. I've seen it for years. They come and say, we are not as well off as you are, give us money. And that is simply not true in terms of public services. It simply isn't true. So our legislators have been conned. They haven't asked the questions. They haven't done the research. You could not ask a single federal legislator to tabulate the 4 ways in which this program is operated and come up with a sensible answer, because they've never done that.
Do you think they know they're being conned?
No, I don't think. To me, the greatest problem here is ignorance by federal legislators, and to some extent Ontario's own provincial legislators. The federal legislators have been conned into believing something that is not true. They've been conned over a period of 50 years. The analysis that would demonstrate economic impact has not been done, and as a result, the consequences have been totally perverse. Ontario's provincial governments over those years have been equally deficient. For example, the current provincial budget says that because Ontario has the lowest per capita spending, its public services are the most efficient, and that is not true. It has the lowest per capita spending because it has the least, or nearly the least, accessible public programs.
But look at the political reality of trying to change we'll get into solutions in a second, but the political reality of trying to change what you're seeking is that there are already a lot of people in this country, and a lot of them are in Ottawa representing other provinces, who feel that the whole Confederation deal for the last 140 years was designed to support Ontario. And suddenly, Ontario's not so wealthy anymore. The other provinces are wealthier now, and now that that's happening, we want to change the deal? Would you acknowledge that looks a little rough?
I would acknowledge that some people would see it that way, but this problem has been developing for 50 long years. Ontario's growth rates have been progressively declining over those years. You can go back to Confederation and make all kinds of complaints. But in my lifetime, the Japanese have emerged from World War II, the Chinese have emerged from Civil War, and have gone on to prosper. To have people from the Maritimes and other parts of Canada go back to the national policy and so on is totally outrageous in light of how the real world works. And I would argue that India and China in particular have left history behind, moved into the future, and that is what these other parts of Canada need to do.
Okay, let me quote one of your critics here. This was in the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix quite recently. The quote goes like this: "The Frontier report," that's you, "is based on indicators that supposedly confirm its hypothesis, while it leaves out others that are crucial to a detailed analysis. For example, it simplistically argues that equalization transfers have led to the creation of more regulated childcare spaces in the have-not provinces. However, since it's parents, not governments, who mostly pay the cost of childcare, the number of overall spaces in a province stems from many factors that go beyond public spending, including the cost of the childcare workforce, cheaper in the Atlantic provinces, staff-to-child ratios, and the cost of childcare facilities." Have they got a point here?
No. Basically, what's important here is the pattern. We talk about childcare spaces, we talk about doctors, we talk about nurses. What people of Ontario have been told for many years is they have to come up with the money to allow these other jurisdictions to come up to a national standard. And that is simply not true. I agree to the extent that the determination of any one of these is always a difficult issue. What's clearly apparent in the overall pattern is that Ontario is last or near last in terms of accessibility to key provincial public services in Canada.
Okay, you say it's a problem for 50 years. I'm now going to read you a quote from 70 years ago. This is from the Royal Commission on Dominion Provincial Relations in 1940, the Rowell-Sirois Commission.
Very famous.
Very famous. Here we go. On equalization, they say, "In Canada today, freedom of movement and equality of opportunity are more important than ever before, and these depend in part on the maintenance of at least minimum national standards for education, public health, and care of the indigent. The most economically distressed areas are the ones least capable of supporting these services, and yet are also the ones in which the needs are likely to be the greatest. Whether the remedy lies in emigration from these areas or in the development of alternative means of livelihood, they must not be allowed to become backwaters of illiteracy and disease. Not only national duty and decency, if Canada is to be a nation at all, but equity and national self-interest demand that the residents of these areas be given average services and equal opportunities." Now, who couldn't sign on to that?
What's important to remember is two things. Nobody is measuring the comparability of services. Government of Canada doesn't even bother to measure the explicit goal mentioned in the Commission report and elsewhere of ensuring comparability of services. Nobody's measuring. The second thing is that the federal program as it now is constituted does not deal with population need at all. It simply compares the revenue capacities of different provincial jurisdictions. If you dealt with population need, the place where the real population need is Ontario and British Columbia. Now let me go on. There is a federal study done on population need equalization. It was done a couple of years ago. It has not been released. It would show, I'm quite sure, that the money should be going to areas of greatest population need, which is Ontario and British Columbia, and we should make an effort to measure population need. We don't do that.
Okay, that does go against the conventional wisdom, though, which says equalization is the glue that kind of keeps the country together. The haves help the have-nots, right?
I think it's the opposite. We get all these arguments over money. We get local politicians stirring people up as a way of holding the rest of the country up to ransom. We get Quebec's entirely unrealistic dependence on the rest of Canada for funding at a huge level. And the rest of the country is quite rightly concerned. I actually think that in the end, this system has the potential to seriously divide the country, not unite it. And there's already some evidence of that.
Okay. What do you want to do?
3 or 4 things. One is the first thing that Mr. Flaherty wants to help us is he should release the study which has been conducted and not released. The Mowat Centre at the University of Toronto has asked for it, and they've been told that they need 8 or 9 months for interdepartmental consultation. So this is an important study. We need it. It will help a lot.
If they were to release it, sorry to interrupt you, I know you're on a flow here, but what would we find out, do you think?
I think we would find out that all this money is going to the areas with the least population need and coming from the jurisdictions with the most. Okay. And the Frontier Centre report essentially supports that with all kinds of statistical analysis.
Okay, so the study's number one. Number two?
We should move toward needs-based equalization. We should build on the comments made in the Rowell-Sirois report and have equalization as something that reflects actual population need. And again, the Government of Canada does not do that. Third thing we should do is transfer the GST revenues from the federal government to the provinces, and the federal government gets out of the transfer payment business. That could be done, and it would restore both accountability and reason to the present system. If you think of it, many of the people spending the taxpayers' money are not the people who have to raise it. And that frustrates all real accountability. So though Ontario government also has a particular duty, its duty is to help inform the Ontario public about what is happening. The comment I made earlier about the current budget doc statement being an error, unfortunately, the Ontario government has consistently, over many, many decades, failed to tell the people of Ontario how their services stand up in terms of accessibility with others. They have also not done the modeling that would require a serious economic impact. And that's a tragedy for Ontario.
But let me just understand what the deal that we transfer, the federal government transfers to the provinces for health and social services and so on about how much right now?
Equalization is about 15 billion expenditure. All the other devices that I mentioned, the other ways the federal government does this, I would guess that we're transferring $40 to $50 billion a year from Ontario and Alberta to other Canadians.
Does that include the health and social transfers?
That includes all transfers, and it includes all those other differential ways in which people of this province are not treated as similarly situated Canadians in other jurisdictions are treated.
But tell me why this isn't just a bookkeeping situation that you're talking about. If you want to cut off transfer payments and in exchange take all the HST revenue, as it will soon be, and hand that off to the provinces, isn't that just sort of giving the provinces the money with this hand instead of with this hand?
Well, what it does do is first of all, it restores accountability. The people who are raising the money, it would be the people who spend it, and that's a very different discipline. The second thing it does is it would avoid the dramatic overconsumption of public services that's evident in places like the province I come from. PEI, but also Nova Scotia and Manitoba and Quebec. An awful lot of this relates to Quebec in the end, although Quebec's problem isn't as big on a per capita basis as the other provinces are. So if we said they get the revenues, they get to carry out the function, the federal government concentrates on its core activities, and there are many of them in our constitutional setup, I think that's the direction. Now, some would say that that would come at the cost of national standards. Well, I've sat on the Standards Council of Canada for many years, and we have underdeveloped that mechanism for ensuring common standards because we basically use money as the glue. I would argue that ideas and other programs and visions of the future should be guiding us, and helping us unite our country, not just writing checks.
So if you're the Prime Minister, sorry, have we finished your list? I know we got to about 3 things on the list.
I could go on.
I know you go on. All right, so let's stick with those 3. If you're Prime Minister tomorrow, this is nothing you can just snap your fingers at and it happens, right? There's a lengthy process, presumably, you got to go through to make this happen. But what's the first thing you do on that list?
If I were him, the first thing I'd do is I would refer this entire problem to an undoubted independent body to look at it and get its consequences and inform all Canadians.
Royal Commission.
Not a Royal Commission, that would take years. Ontario would gradually fade away by the time a Royal Commission report came in. I would do a quick reference to undoubted independent economic observers, get a full analysis of this system, its complications, its consequences, and most importantly, the solutions.
Can I pick up on that? You said Ontario, we can't wait for a Royal Commission report. Ontario would fade away by then. Well, this is 13 million people here. We just had a budget over $100 billion. What do you mean fade away?
Ontario is 13 million people. Its rates of growth have been slowly declining over a 50-year period. It is contributing twice as much in some years to this system as its growth, expressed as a percentage of its output. You can't do that. I would argue that the place where this system will have the greatest impact is Ontario, and it will gradually lose the productivity competition with the rest of the world, and it will gradually become more and more third-bearer and gray, no matter how hard its provincial government works. The problem here is grave for the future of Ontario. And Ontario has 40% of the Canadian population. We really need to think about the consequences.
I know you have been beating this drum for a long, decades. I know you've been at it for a long time.
30 years or more.
Well, why don't people seem to share the same? People in decision-making capacities seem to share your urgency.
The biggest problem is ignorance. For example, Len Crispino and I, and Len is the president of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, got up 5 years ago and warned about this. The then Prime Minister, Mr. Martin, and Mr. Goodale got up and said, oh no, it'll never happen. Ontario will never become a have-not province. It's the engine of growth, blah, 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 blah. Now, we were right. Mr. Crispino and I predicted well in advance. I'm on the record here for now for 15 years, and every single prediction I've made, by and large, has come true. And the thing that troubles me most is that our policymakers in the government of Canada have little or no understanding of just what the consequences of this are.
Have you talked to Premier McGuinty about this?
I have talked to politicians of all types over many, many years.
Not all types, the Premier. Have you talked to the Premier
Yes,
today?
I have talked very briefly with him.
And what does he say?
Well, he has done the most important thing that an Ontario Premier has done since the Second World War, in my view. He put this on the public record in his first term. I think he needs to be more consistent about it. But I don't in any way discount the importance of his initial discussion of this subject and his initial expressions of concern.
But you want him to beat the Prime Minister's door down on this.
I think what he's got to do, we're starting a new institute, and the reason we're starting it is because we believe that if this story is told factually and cleanly, people will draw their own conclusions and they will be right.
But you need a champion. Who's your champion?
Well, we need a champion. We need to have some legislators start to really grab this before it's too late.
So who's into this?
I think many of them are, but the trouble with it is we have a permanent national coalition of minority governments. Each of our major parties is a very tenuous alliance, and they have great difficulty. What happened in Italy, though, could happen here. In Italy, the Northern League developed out of resentment against the transfers to the Southern Italy. It became a very powerful force in national politics, and arguably it may have led to its balkanization. If that would be what I think will happen sometime in the future, if federal governments don't address this and if the province doesn't consistently pursue it.
David MacKinnon, we're really glad you came in today to tell us all about it. This was a discussion about equalization, and I actually understood it all.
So the OIPP, go oipp.ca.
That's your new institute.
That's the new website.
oipp.ca. Good of you to come in tonight to the TVO.
Thank you
So much.